map that, is always 20 below in January. So
Well, I spent 2 years working on a doctorate in history at the University of Alberta that I never got in Edmonton. That was cold.
oh yeah, yeah.
All right, so I think we can get started now. Yuwon trying to log on, but she's having internet problems at the hotel she's staying at. So hopefully we'll see her connect on.
Okay, this is obviously going to be pretty informal, and feel free to interrupt for questions or anything. This is partly based on an article I did for that special issue of Cogenta Education that that was done, and this PowerPoint has some material from that and some material that's from other places. The idea of affirming identity through most of the history of U.S. education has been very assimilationist, that you should lose your identity, whether you're an immigrant from Europe or South America, and assimilate. And that's the way to success. And I'm going to try to give a case that that's not the real answer, and that some of the effects of assimilation are pretty negative in terms of the Hollywood movies that kids watch and television and everything else, violent video games. So Dylan Platero was actually the head of the Rough Rock School, the first school at modern times, Indian control school in modern times. You always have to say modern times because the Cherokee used to run their schools and other tribes in Oklahoma until the government stopped them. And they had a very high literacy rate when they ran their own schools. But he was running Rough Rock and then became the director of Navajo Division of Education. He was actually, my wife was teaching at that school when I met her. But he talks about a typical Navajo student in the 1975 article, Key, sort of a John Smith, was sent to boarding school as a child, where as a practice he was punished for speaking Navajo. Since he was only allowed to return home during Christmas and summer, he lost contact with his family. That he didn't assimilate, but he didn't learn Navajo very well. And this has caused, real problems with many Navajos. You can exaggerate the amount of alcoholism and stuff, but there's certainly a problem. And that some of the ways that schooling was done helped lead to those problems. That didn't identify with being white, but because he'd have been off in boarding school, not identifying with being Navajo, didn't speak Navajo well. More recently, Lori Arvizo Alvord, the first Navajo woman surgeon, wrote in her book about her mother was white, but her father was Navajo, about how he and his mother was punished in school for speaking Navajo, and that they were told the only way to be successful was to learn English and forget your native language and culture. And she writes a little more about this and the effect it had on her father, who became an alcoholic. And 2 or 3 generations of our tribe had been taught to feel shame about our culture. Parents had often not taught their children traditional Navajo beliefs and the Navajo language, the very thing that would have shown them how to live, the very thing that could have kept them strong. So just some narrative about the poor effects of assimilationist education. And there's a even more recent study out of Canada of 152 First Nation bands, these Indigenous villages in the province of British Columbia, that in the villages that had lost their language more had 6 times the suicide rate as those that have kept their language. Well, they don't have any measure of culture there that they could use. So I think language is a very good proxy for culture, that language loss is cultural loss. And so this is some protesters when back around 2001, the voters in Arizona passed an English for the Children Act that banned bilingual education. Arizona is an English-only state. I wish we had something like Indian Education for All, though I just heard it lost a bunch of funding. So this isn't just for American Indians. The National Research Council out of Washington, D.C. founded that immigrants from Europe, from South America, Africa, were healthier than their counterparts from non-immigrant families, Native Americans in the sense of not American Indians, but just whites. The longer immigrant youth are in the U.S., the poorer their overall physical and psychological health. The more likely they are to eat at McDonald's, less nutritional food, the more likely to watch these violent video games and that kind of thing. And there's been some updates of that. We passed the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001 that was supposed to close the achievement gap, and the Every Student Succeeds Act under Obama isn't much different. They prioritize English language acquisition rather than promoting bilingualism. They call for evidence-based educational approaches, but if you start looking at the evidence, one, it doesn't involve student studies that had American Indians in them. You know, it's if you get minorities in these studies, it tends to be African Americans or Hispanics. So, you know, what's the evidence based? And then if you go on the What Works Clearinghouse and look at these published, Pearson and these curriculums, these textbooks, you find that there's very little real evidence to back them up. So some of the trends, this was from our special issue of Education Week a few years ago, and it's hard to get more updated information. But you can see that the No Child Left Behind approach, which is not very different from Every Student Succeed, has not closed this achievement gap. And you look at high school graduation rates, and I'm not sure what happened with the Hispanics and blacks. That's improved. In Tucson, they had an ethnic studies program where 1 period a day in the high school, the Mexican-American students had a ethnic studies class that focused on their culture, Mexican-American culture, and that changed the dropout rate from 50% to practically nothing. Of course, the state legislature then outlawed that. It's gone back and forth. My understanding, it's back in now. But, you know, No Child Left Behind, a one-size-fits-all educational reform, using evidence that, you know, does not focus on American Indians. So there's a new book out, 2016, The New Trail of Tears, How Washington is Destroying American Indians, and it was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal, you know, Republican, very positively. I think she wrote something in there that it's government welfare policies that is causing the disintegration of families on Indian reservations. That's her argument. And she actually interviewed Dick Littlebear. But I mean, she visited a few schools in South Dakota and just, you know, a real quickie study to, this privatize everything, you know, charter schools and all that. Similar conservative criticism led to the termination policy of the 50s, which was to set free the Indians. And of course, they unterminated those reservations like a Menominee because it just sank the tribe's that voted to terminate themselves deeper into debt. So I actually failed my comps for a doctorate in history at the University of Alberta after 2 years. My doctorate is one of the things I'm interested in is persistence and resilience, why some people bounce back from adversity and others don't. My doctorate is second time around at Montana State University, which I really appreciated what they did for me. Gave me a doctorate and I didn't have to go into debt but my interest in history has continued even though I didn't get that doctorate in history. In the second edition of my book with Jeannie Eder, who was at Montana State University Billings when I went there. In fact, she was on the committee that hired me. The second edition of that book just came out. My telephone there. So what's interesting to me is I found this quote from Roger Echohawk from Oklahoma, that we are all human beings. We should give up our racial identity. We should be a colorblind society. There's research supporting the fact that students that see themselves as just human beings, not African American or Hispanic or American Indian, are more subject to stereotype threat, and which is where stereotype threat is. Some studies show that kids can perform worse on their tests than they have the knowledge, but they have trouble putting it on tests because of anxiety and stuff. So this idea of going to a colorblind society and giving up your identity, that you're all human beings. There's a study out of Michigan that when those students that saw themselves that way, and I think it was African American students, just saw themselves as human beings, when they did run up against racism, they were less able to handle it. So Joy Harjo from Oklahoma, the American Indians were colonized in this country, teaches us to hate ourselves. The idea of Indians as savages and needed to become civilized, and that was the role of schools, to civilize Indians. And the history in the United States is not too much different from Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And these are the four countries that voted against the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People back in 2007. Now, they've all reversed their position since then, though. I haven't heard Trump say anything about it. So another example, this Albert Neal started out as a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse on the Pine Ridge Reservation around, get the date right, about 1900, late 1800s. And he found that the Indian Bureau, what we now call the Bureau of Indian Education, went on the assumption that any Indian custom was per se objectionable, whereas the customs of the whites were the ways of civilization. And you see a certain amount of that still today. So some of the research done at Diley, I think it's 30 years now, study Navajo and Ute students in the southeast Utah. She found that students with a strong sense of cultural identity, Navajo and Ute, Southern Ute, could overcome the structural inequalities in American society and the discrimination they faced as American Indians. Another study by and Laframboy, I forget what tribe she is. She's at Stanford University, but they did an article in 2001. It was a study of Upper Plains tribes that traditional cultural values defined a good way of life typified by pro-social attitudes and expectations, and learning the native culture is a resiliency factor. So if kids ran into trouble, got an F in a course or something, they didn't just drop out or give up, that they could bounce back. What Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Human Rights, what do Native leaders think about cultural rights and their culture? I've been collecting these and don't have a whole lot. I wish I had some from Montana, but I did find a quote from the then Navajo Nation elected president, that preservation of Navajo culture, tradition, and language is their number one guiding principle. And his successor, Joe Shirley, when they had one of these shootings at Red Lake, high school students, a couple high school students, and I think a teacher were killed, that it's the loss of these traditional beliefs, respect for elders, respect for others, that has led to these the types of violence we see on and off reservations in this country today, and of course elsewhere. So this is a continuation of that quote. Because we are losing our values as a people, it behooves Native nations and governments that still have their ceremonies, their traditions, and their medicine people to do all they can to hang on to these. And as I will get to pretty quick, immersion, culture-based education programs and language immersion programs are doing a pretty good job of this, but they're pretty small right now in terms of there's not a lot of them, and but they are growing, I think, and showing success. So, as I say, I've been involved in this. I got my first job out on the Navajo reservation out in the early 70s, and it was the only place I could get a job at the time. Some grandmother I remember telling me, all you white people just come out here for the money. And I said, yes, $8,000 a year. But I don't know what it was, but all I knew it was about American Indians was out of cowboy, John Wayne type movies or something, or earlier than that, Roy Rogers. But they had just opened Navajo Community College down the road, 15 miles from Chinle, where I got a job teaching math. They were desperate for math teachers, even though I was a history major. And so I enrolled in a Navajo language class, because back then, all the kids spoke Navajo pretty much that I had, all 180 of them. 6 sections of math, 30 plus students each section. And the second semester, I took a course in Navajo history and culture because I thought I needed to know something about these students that I was teaching. And in that second class, one of my classmates from Rough Rock, that was 15 miles the other way down the road, that was taking the class. She missed a class and asked the instructor, could she get some notes? And he pointed over to me and said, oh, that white guy seems to take good notes. It was a Navajo instructor. And so she asked me, I asked her she wanted some coffee, and if I could buy her a cup of coffee. There was a little coffee shop in, not Starbucks back then, in many farms. And we got married that summer, and we are still married. But I had taught for a little while in a white school, and I couldn't get the kids shut up. In the Navajo school at Chinle, I couldn't get the kids to talk. They were very respectful of adults. It kept me in teaching, and of course getting married kept me. Most of the teachers there were brand new teachers at Chinle, and in 2 or 3 years they were gone. They moved to Albuquerque, or they moved to Phoenix. So you had a constant turnover of teachers. And that Lori Alviso Albert, I don't have the quote in there, talks about that at Crown Point, where she went to school. The the students were always getting teachers in training rather than experienced teachers. They were doing their best, I think, often, but, it takes a while to become a good teacher. Most of us don't land on our feet and just know what to do right away. So this Naomi Shafee Riley that, writing about how terrible Indian education is, and it's because of government programs. This Terry Huffman, 30 years ago, was teaching at a college in the Midwest, in the Great Plains, Upper Great Plains, and somebody came to him and said, "We have a very high Indian dropout rate at this college. What can we do? Can you do some studying of why that is?" So he started a study there with some local people, and he's continued it to this day. And this book, Tribal Strengths and Native Education, just came out 2018, brand new book, where he goes in-depth interview of 6 tribal educators, Native educators. This isn't the research study like the government wants, where you have a horse race study and you use this reading program and that reading program and try to see which reading program gets a little better test scores. But this is actually asking experienced Native educators what they see needs to be done. And his research, and I mean, this is just the culmination of this 30 years. He has a bunch of other material published, focus on student identity and tribal strengths. And one of his principals, a Native American principal he interviewed, and part of these administrators came from Montana. NCLB has changed teaching so much. I mean, assessment is the drive, and it's like we're forgetting the child. We're leaving the child behind because we've forgotten teaching styles, and like I said, the language and culture. That has all been put on the back burner when they should actually be up front. So basically, Donna Diley's 30 years, when research and my own experience of 30 plus years in Indian education, this is what I've found is, So one of his earlier books, and I have references at the end of this, this is one where he interviewed like 16 or 17 experienced educators, but not as in-depth as the newest book, rejects the notion that American Indian students must undergo some form of assimilation to succeed academically. That his research finds that a strong sense of cultural identity serves as an emotional and cultural anchor. And he first, again, these studies started with college students coming from the reservation to this Midwest college where he was working. But this newer research is with K-12 educators. Individuals gain self-assurance, self-worth, even a sense of purpose from their ethnicity. By forging a strong cultural identity, individuals develop confidence to explore a new culture and not be intimidated. They do not have to fear cultural loss through assimilation. They know who they are, and why they are engaged in mainstream education. So they're not rejecting education. These immersion programs that immerse kids in their native language because they don't speak it, tribal language, they use computers. They're not turning back the clock. So an earlier study, Collective Wisdom, this was over 100 experienced educators by Cleary and Peacock, a little older, back 1998. And one of their many educators, and these were Indigenous and non-Indigenous educators of Indigenous students. The key to producing successful American Indian students in our modern education system is to first ground these students in their American Indian belief and value systems. So this research goes back a ways. I hear Sherman Alexie has got in trouble with the Me Too movement, but I'm having my students turn in a report on his Absolutely True Diary book next week. But he deals with this, at the beginning of the book, that Indians are savages and losers. And so that's why he leaves the reservation and goes to this off-reservation school. It's a little collapsed. I just read his biography of his mother, and what goes on in 1 year in this book actually was over 3 years or so. But that you can become bicultural and go back and forth. And that comes out, I think, at the end of this particular book that I think would be a good book for high school students to read. So this is a sign at the Presbyterian Mission School on the Navajo Reservation about 1950. I throw it in because I think, the assimilation idea, that tradition is the enemy of progress. And, that we send this message to immigrants and American Indians. And I think it's a wrong message. So Sheila Nicholas at the University of Arizona interviewed her Hopi elders and found that they view the recent decline in youth speaking Hopi to be associated with their un-Hopi behavior, leading to gang activity and disrespect of elders, whereas the Hopi language is associated with traditional values of hard work, reciprocity, and humility. All these studies of the achievement gap show Asian students doing better than white students. And, if the anthropologists and archaeologists are right, American Indians have Asian ancestry. So what is the difference going on here? And one of it is Asian culture is you do well in school if you put in the effort, if you work hard. I sort of grew up, my white middle class nuclear family culture. If you do well in school, you're smart. If you change that attitude from doing well in school because you're smart to doing well in school because you do your homework, you study, you put in the time, you'll see the change. Indigenous and other youth need to develop a strong sense of identity that focuses on respect. American Indians and other minorities are disproportionately in the prison system. Some of that is because of racism. But as students lose traditional values of respect, they're more likely to talk back to policemen and teachers and others, and that can get you in trouble. I mean, people should deserve respect by the way they treat people, but until you get to know somebody that they don't deserve respect, you need to show them respect. And as kids lose their traditional culture, what impressed me at Chinle 40 years ago was these kids had a lot of respect for anybody that was older and for each other. Traditional Navajo values. So Dick Littlebear talked about this back in 1999. He actually came to one of our language conferences here and keynoted it. Traditional values and the native language are an antidote to gangs. So I got to go up to Alaska to a multicultural conference about 30 years ago. No, more like 25. And they were giving out this card that's laminated. It's a wallet card, and got it in my wallet right now. I won't try to take it out. But, this idea that there's nothing of value in native cultures and that native people should assimilate. Well, I looked at this list, and there wasn't anything that I didn't see as something that I want for my kid. Of course, in there they have hunter success. The Hopis would have farming success, but you don't do much farming north of the Arctic Circle. And I've collected some similar lists of values from tribes across the nation and elsewhere. and you know, they're all a little bit different, but they all have, you know, respect tends to be there. So heard Celia Fire Thunder speak at the National Indian Education Association back in 2005. At that time, she was president of the Oglala Sioux tribe nation. She spoke about her gratefulness for the sacrifices her ancestors made and the need to have an identity and belong somewhere. She declared, "I speak English well because I spoke Lakota well." And I've come across similar quotes elsewhere. Our languages are value-based. Everything I need to know is in our language. Language is not just communication. It's bringing back our values and good things about how to treat each other. And she called for tribal language and total immersion Head Start programs in Indian country. So I actually worked for a year as the assistant director for academics at Rock Point. Back in the early 70s, that's when I started teaching just down the road about 30, 40 miles in Chinle. They found the school board, which was incidentally, I learned later, all Native American church members. It was the breakdown of a working knowledge of Navajo kinship that caused much of what they perceived as inappropriate, un-Navajo behavior. Kids talking back to their elders and stuff. The way back they felt was to teach students that system. And because back then most of the kids spoke Navajo, they instituted a bilingual education program. And my two kids were actually in that program for a year when I was there. Now they need an immersion program because television and Hollywood movies and stuff, many of the kids are coming to school not speaking Navajo now. So it's a revitalization that has to be done. But back then they were still coming with, but it was beginning to break down. Actually taught in the school pictured there. That's at Window Rock, actually Fort Defiance, part of the Window Rock School District. That's the Window Rock's Navajo capital. They have an immersion school there. And Catherine Manuelito, Navajo, she teaches at ASU. I don't think she's retired yet. She's my age, close to it. She did a study of a first-year Navajo immersion teacher at the Window Rock School. It was moved from Fort Defiance, where that picture is, down the road a few years later. But the students tend to act more responsibly in the immersion school because that's the behavior that was taught and expected. So less discipline problems. And you can always teach more and better if you have less discipline problems. So this is from her study, Catherine Manuelito's study. Navajo values are embedded in the classroom pedagogy. They use Navajo kinship terms when they're talking to each other. And a parent noticed a lot of differences compared to the other students who aren't in the immersion program. This is a school within a school. The immersion students that all Navajo for the first few years, kindergarten through about third grade, seem more disciplined and have a lot more respect for older, well, anyone like teachers. They communicate better with their grandparents. Incidentally, I have a brother-in-law who speaks hardly any English, and he has grandchildren that speak hardly any Navajo. And of course, how do you pass on family values when the grandchildren can't listen and communicate with their grandparents? And that's, the school has had a lot to do with that. Their uncles and stuff. It seems like it makes them more mature, more respectful. I see other kids and they just run around crazy. My kids aren't like that. It really helps because it's a positive thing. I have my students in a parent involvement class, and our biggest group in Arizona is Mexican Americans, and I have them read a book by Guadalupe Valdez, and it's called Con Respeto is the title. She's at Stanford University. With respect, and Mexican American values focus on respect. And of course, the average Mexican American is 80% or so genetically indigenous. So the Hawaiians have done quite a bit with this. going back to the 1980s, when almost no Native Hawaiian kids spoke Hawaiian. They'd had 100 years of having it outlawed in the schools. But the kids spoke no Hawaiian, just some of the elders did, basically, but they had some of the lowest test scores in the nation. So this idea of just learn English and you'll do well in school is flawed. And we can see that in various places where they've done English only, including Arizona right now. The Penenaleo movement, this is the Hawaiian immersion language nest and schools, grew out of a dream that be reestablished throughout Hawaii, the mana of a living Hawaiian language from the depth of our origins. This movement initiates, provides for, and nurtures various Hawaiian language environments, and we find our strength in our spirituality, love of our language, love of our people, love of our land, and love of knowledge. And of course, as I say, they're teaching these kids about computers and stuff. In the first graduating class where they had Hawaiian language education through high school, there was about 11 kids in it. So these often are small schools. They only introduced English in the school curriculum at 5th grade, though when the kids went home, outside the school grounds, they heard a lot of English. But five of the boys joined the Marines. So this idea that, you're not going to be a patriotic American if you get educated in the Hawaiian language or some other language. So the Navajo Nation has actually put together Diné cultural content standards, what they want their kids to learn, that a firm grounding of the Navajo students in their indigenous culture, heritage, and language is fundamentally sound prerequisite to a well-developed and culturally healthy students. And the Navajo values to be taught include being generous and kind, respecting kinship, values, and sacred knowledge. So research on bilingualism, kids that, people that are bilingual are less likely to get Alzheimer's disease, that there's a cognitive advantage. Monolingualism is like a set of blinders. Knowing 2 languages is knowing more than one way to see the world. So there's been a couple doctoral studies at NAU where they interviewed Navajo elders, one done by Evangeline Parsons Yazzie, where she interviewed them in Navajo, another one done by a white teacher who used a translator. And they came up with very similar to what Sheila Nicholas did later. Navajo elder noted at the beginning of the 21st century, about 2000, TV has ruined us. Movies are being watched every day by the kids, and there's nothing good in it. And again, there's PBS TV, but I watch some movies and so Catherine Manuelito, I mentioned her before, did this study of this immersion. I think this is a duplicate slide. Sorry about that. There was a similar study done in Hawaii of a first-year immersion teacher. And she noted that these are quotes from that article in that Cogent Education that's online. Part of the success of the school was the teacher staff and teachers show much aloha. I don't know why teachers is repeated there. They went to write about aloha is a Hawaiian word that is profound and complex, but of all, it is the wholeness of mind, body, soul, and connectedness to the universe. So one of the things you get from bilingualism is that words often don't have simple translations from one language to another. So you get a more in-depth thinking of, what words can mean. In the school, aloha was shown by hugs by teachers, staff, and students. Opinion is sought and valued from all, and the realization the school's success is dependent on the family, the unit working together. I'm teaching a parent involvement class online today, and this semester, and see that again and again. The children learn to respect one another, respect the space of others, and to work quietly and diligently on class activities. Teachers and staff are role models through silent leadership and responsible actions. The power was not well wielded by anyone in particular, rather it flows amongst all, as it did in ancestral times. By seeing this and putting it in practice, the children learn to honor and respect themselves, others, and all the other things around them. Being thoughtful in school transfers to the home, making it safe and comfortable. For kindergartners, the first graders become the role models as they have gone through the experiences that the younger ones are going through. This is the beauty of a multi-age, multidisciplinary classroom. One thing I noticed in Hawaii is some of the immersion schools use the Montessori method, because it is congruent with American Indian and Indigenous practices, even though it came out of Maria Montessori and her work in Italy with the poor. So more on this Hawaiian immersion school that she writes about. This is after a year there. Teaching in the school. The day began and ended with a traditional Hawaiian protocol, a Hawaiian chant, positive thought, and a prayer to open and close the day. Included in the morning protocol was a formal request chant and a reply in Hawaiian to enter the school. The students do the request, the teachers do the reply, chant the reply. So, it sets a mood for the day. The whole culture permeates. My students tell me not to read my PowerPoint, and I'm glad to share this PowerPoint. So, one of the problems with STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, that can help you build bombs. It can do good things, but it's not enough. So this is from another study by Luning and Yamamochi for Hawaiian Immersion School, and I have it in the references. Just more on this. So Terry McCarty shared some slides about these Hawaiian medium education, where they're teaching math and science in the Hawaiian language. And it's a college prep program. So they introduce English in 5th grade about. Various schools do it at different age levels. Actually, there's one little island in Hawaii where the kids are still speaking Hawaiian in the home and go to school more fluent in Hawaiian than they do in English. And obviously, you would want to introduce English earlier for those kids. But again, you don't want the English to replace Hawaiian. So you really have to look at the kids and a local community situation. You can't just transfer one of these programs. Oh, they did it like this and we're successful, we'll do it here. If you don't have parent support, forget it. So the students surpassed non-immersion peers on English standardized tests. Now, obviously, if they're getting all English at all Hawaiian or all Navajo or all Blackfeet in the very early grades, it's going to take a while before they do this. You might not see this right away. And one of the things is parents have to choose to send these kids to school, and any school that a parent chooses to send their kid to, the kid's probably going to do better no matter what the program is because of the parental support. But we still see 50% graduation rates. I mentioned it for Tucson Mexican American students. You still find it in some places for American Indian students. These immersion schools, because of the parental support, because of the peer group support, and all these values and respect, tend to have 100% high school graduation rates, 80% college attendance rate. Not everybody wants to go to college, and sending a kid to college that doesn't want to be there is a mistake. You can be very successful without a college education, though it certainly helps. So the goal, they are immersing kids. Old Ronald Reagan, I think it was, well, immersion works. Let's immerse them in English. Well, the difference is the goal. They're immersing kids in Hawaiian or Navajo or, in that little school up on the Blackfeet Reservation, Daryl Kipps worked with. But the goal is really bilingualism. So looking at the psychological benefits, not just the test scores. We have people in jail with high test scores, embezzled money. I always tell my college students, don't take a gun and rob $200 from a 7-Eleven. Get a college education and embezzle $50,000, $500,000, and you'll go to jail for less time. So these are some test scores from the Navajo immersion program a few years ago. At the 5th grade level, it's a school within a school, so you had the mainstream Navajo students and the immersion students in the same school, different classrooms. And you can see that the immersion students, they weren't necessarily doing real great. 23 percentile in math is not, you want them at the 50th percentile, but average. But it's better than the students that are getting all English, pretty much. I think the mainstream students might be getting Navajo 30 minutes twice a week. There's some, I don't have them in this PowerPoint, some similar graphs from the immersion program that we have in Flagstaff, Puente de Hojo, where there's a Navajo immersion. So Sioux author and teacher Luther Standing Bear, first, according to his autobiography, the first student through the door of Carlisle Indian School, the first big government off-reservation boarding school. He concluded in his autobiography, and he was a teacher, that young Indian students needed to be doubly educated so they learned to appreciate both their traditional life and modern life. So we published a bunch of books. Our most recent book has one of those studies of the first-year immersions teachers in Hawaii, and one of the little older ones, and they're all online. That's actually my son in the cradle board. He's an engineer now. I flunked out of engineering in the middle of my junior year. My father was an engineer. He went to school at Hart Butte and Rocky Boy. He's an engineer now. So going back to, these conservative English only, So this is a diagram I got permission to use out of the Hawaiian study. They talk about culture-based education. Culture-based education does not have to use the native language, but it's stronger, I think, if it does. Ohana there in the top blue thing, Ohana is the extended family. I had culture shock when I went out to the Navajo reservation. Shocked by the good behavior of the kids compared to the bad behavior of some white students I had the previous year. I'd quit a job teaching in a white community because the kids wouldn't listen to me. Ohana and talk about culture shock. When I got married, I came from a nuclear family and married into an extended family, and I'm still in an extended family. But that culture-based education leads to social emotional development on the left side there. Self-worth, not self-esteem. I think we need to be careful about self-esteem. I'm great. Our president has a little too much about that. Cultural identity, relationship with the extended family and community, and this leads to educational outcomes, student engagement. The United States Congress established a national reading panel, and their recommendations became reading first, that they spent millions of dollars on under No Child Left Behind, and is still there. And they focused on phonics and ignored student engagement in the research they looked at. If you don't have student engagement, if my doctoral thesis dissertation at Montana State University was looking at reading textbooks, because some psychologists said that in the 60s that the stories in reading textbooks, not only were the stories about all white people, all white kids, blonde-haired and blue-eyed, but also they were boring. Brother and sisters never fought. Mother and dad never fought. No conflict, no excitement. I went to author speaking of the author of the book, The Day No Pigs Would Die, at Montana State University when I was a student there. And he said, plot is 2 dogs and 1 bone. Conflict, good and evil in Harry Potter. If you have boring stories. Well, I looked at basal readers in the 1980s for my dissertation, and the stories were still boring. You don't look at Now, that doesn't mean you have to have American Indian stories for American Indians. You need some. But second graders seem to like dinosaurs, whatever their culture in. Find out what the students are interested in. When I asked the librarian when I was at Chinle, what are the students interested in? Western horsemen. Rodeo. But that the National Reading Panel, and that the research that went into No Child Left Behind on reading left out a key thing. Leads to student achievement, good test scores, and student behavior. And of course, good student behavior will keep students out of jail in the long run. Keep them from being suspended from school. So, the Kamehameha Schools Research and Evaluation Division, research takes money. The Kamehameha Schools has money. They have a lot of real estate under the city of Honolulu, left by the last queen of Hawaii for the benefit of Hawaiian children. So they had money to do a study. They surveyed 600 teachers, almost 3,000 students, 2,000 plus parents in 62 schools. I wish we had money to do more studies like this. That culture-based education positively impacts students' socio-emotional well-being. the whole child, not just his test scores. 2, enhance his socio-emotional well-being, in turn positively affects math and reading test scores. Not self-esteem so much as self-efficacy. I can do it. But realizing that doing it, I'm smart, I can do it, but I can learn, I can put in the effort to learn it. Number 3 is positively related to math and reading test scores for all students, and particularly for those of low socio-emotional development, most notably when supported by overall CBUs within the school. So if they're coming out of broken families and stuff, the school can be a family. Kids coming out of poverty need this, really. So, culture-based education is having real good results, I think, with immersion. It's not a panacea. It doesn't solve all the problems. It doesn't work with every kid. We've had kids drop out of the Puente de Hojo program, the immersion program here in, for one reason or another, in Flagstaff. But if kids are sticking with it and show positive test scores. So, the popular culture, if we don't have an antidote for it in the family and in the school. And Vine Deloria, my son really liked his book, God is Red. I really like this particular quote from him. And assimilationist education dishonors the past. So Alaska has done some really great things. They have these pamphlets online, full text, culturally responsive schools, and of course Montana with Indian Education for All Act. But again, you got to keep fighting. If my understanding of partial defunding has taken place, it's like cleaning a house. You get the house clean, but if you just stop there, it's just, you got to keep fighting. Oscar Quagley, he was part of that study of the first-year immersion teacher in Hawaii. This culture-based education is part of a slow healing process for the Alaska Native villages. And looking at the whole child, place-based education. So Mary Smith spoke at a language conference many years ago. It was one I missed, the last speaker of her language. In California, they're bringing back languages that nobody speaks, using linguistic records at the University of California at Berkeley and places like that. So, there are, even if you have no speakers, you can make an effort. And making efforts like that give people a purpose in life. A purpose other than having a fancier car than your neighbor, or a bigger house, or a faster car, or whatever. So please turn back to your own and learn your language, so you won't be alone like me, the last speaker of her language. Go to the young people. Let go of the hate in your hearts. All the massacres and stuff. Love and respect yourself first. Elders, please give them courage, and they will never be alone. Dick Littlebear mentions that sometimes the elders, because they constantly criticize the kids because they're not pronouncing the words like a native speaker, they're learning them in kindergarten or first grade, and so they're not going to have a native-like pronunciation probably. they criticize the kids, and that's counterproductive. Natives, second language learners of a language are going to have a real trouble having native-like pronunciation. Help our people to understand their identity, who they are, their strength to have survived thousands of years, to have survived colonialism. We need to publish materials for our people. We need to educate the white people to us and for Indigenous people. So that was, trying to remember the name of the language conference, the 25th Stabilizing Indigenous Language Conference that started here at NAU. Dick Littlebear was there, among others. The 25th one is at the University of Lethbridge this summer. So Leanne Hinton has worked in California for many years, retired from the University of California at Berkeley. Family values, so grandparents and grandchildren can talk. So I have a link to the Cogent articles on this Teaching Indigenous Languages website. And our books like this, Indigenous Language Revitalization, are full text, free, downloadable on the website. And a little about me, 2015, this Teaching Indigenous Students book, the last chapter is by myself and, trying to think of his name. He works with Rock Point School and has worked with the Immersion School at Window Rock, co-authored with me. There's some stuff about the reading there and some others. So some of the references that I quoted in here, the study actually online about the 6 times the suicide rate with the villages that had lost their language more. And again, culture is there, but they didn't have a measure of culture. They just had a measure of language. So I think the language loss is a proxy for cultural loss. These Hawaiian studies of a first-year immersion teacher, Dr. Littlebear, I quoted him. Catherine Manuelito's study of the first-year Navajo immersion teacher at Window Rock, Arizona, with the Navajo. Some of the stuff I've written, some of it's online, some of it is not. I just got an email today that it's a different publisher now, but they want a second edition of the 2006 book, Education and Language Restoration, which I really wrote, was told was to write for high school students. That they're going to do a second edition of that. This Riley, The New Trail of Tears, How Washington is Destroying American Indians. That's really the right-wing approach, and I quoted that one, give up being Indian, that's racist. Thank you all. Any questions, comments? You've been all real quiet.
I'm thinking about a question. I'm typing it in, but I'm not quite there yet. So this is Lori, And I'm an L2 educator. I teach at Portland State University, and I teach English to foreign students. So I'm used to dealing with students who are often coming from cultures with different worldviews. And I know at our university there's been a big push for culturally responsive teaching, but it seems like no one's really sure how to approach that in a way that's well, that gets the results I think they're aiming for. Do you have any particular recommendations in terms of culturally responsive teaching that you feel is effective?
Well, part of it is if you in an urban area, you often have a real mix of kids from different cultures. So you can't do the same kind of thing that you could do at a school on a reservation where often the kids are mostly from one tribe.
Yeah.
But, and again, is this sort of a supplemental, or is this going to be permeate through the curriculum, that the teaching style that the teacher uses even to teach math is culturally congruent. So, one is to, especially for an outsider like me, one of the first things I didn't learn Navajo, but at least the first thing I did was sign up for a Navajo language class. And I was just lucky to be in a time and a place because they had just opened Navajo Community College down the road from Chinle, first tribal college in the world. So, part of it is, who can you learn from? Are there elders available that you can talk to and then come to the classroom? And if it's a group that has different cultures, then you're going to have to get different elders. But I think you will find some congruence. I've certainly found that people that come from different, I come from a white middle-class nuclear family, but I looked at those values that were listed on that wallet card from Alaska, and they were congruent with many of the things I learned. And if I didn't learn them, I thought they were a good idea to learn. Incidentally, Dr. Huffman, who I was quoting, is at George Fox University in Portland.
Oh, yeah.
I believe it's a Quaker university.
Well, it looks like there's a question up there from Lenore.
I'm not sure I can read got a box here where I can read?
Yeah, or I can just say what it says. Says, thank you so much for the insightful presentation. You discuss a lot about systemic racism that serves to undermine language and revitalization. Do you have some references that will help to take down the barriers of this racism? This is so pervasive throughout the country.
Well, in references, there's all the human rights declarations of the United Nations leading up, it goes back to the end of World War II, but and probably the most recent is the 2007 Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which Obama signed on to. So that is one source. I'm trying to think what else, aspects of a lot of the conservatives talk about this being a Christian nation. And of course, there's a lot of Christians, including my wife, that are American Indian, but that to love your neighbor. I think one thing to try to get people to think about is the golden rule ethnocentric? Do unto others as you would like them to do unto you. Well, maybe they want to be treated differently than you want to be treated. And if and vice versa, that but to love your neighbor and to respect your neighbor, I think that you find that in a lot of different religions. And so, I know, for example, at Rock Point, there was a Lutheran school. You had this contract Bureau of Indian Education school, back then Bureau of Indian Affairs school, but there was a Lutheran mission school. But from what I understood is the Presbyterian minister at that school was supportive of the Rock Point school. They did not see themselves as in competition, and that to let the parents decide where they want to send their kids to school, but don't undermine each other and one's efforts. These immersion schools, all the ones I know of are parents have to choose to send their kids to them. So nobody's forced to go to them. And so you get the support and, at least have a live and let live. Rock Point, as I said, back then, I don't know about now, all the elected school board members were Native American Church, which is not the traditional Navajo religion. And you had a mixture of kids coming from Christian families, Native American Church families, and traditional Navajo religion families. And some of these Christian churches had Navajo Bibles written in the Navajo language. So it was very interesting to me. There's a couple of studies done of Native American church ceremonies that go all night on a Saturday night with drumming, and I'm not expert on them. But the descriptions of them, the roadman was there with a high school student and the high school student's family, telling that student to study hard, stay in school, get away from this idea, if you're not Christian, you're going to go to hell, or vice versa. And being accepting of differences and multiculturalism. So I don't know if that, but one thing we've tried to do with the website here, Dr. Lockhart and some of my colleagues, is to show, success stories. What's in New Zealand, in Hawaii, on the Navajo reservation. That little, we have an article, we dedicated one of our books to Darrell Kipp, and his son and some of the people involved with that church, with that little immersion school up there, published. We dedicated the whole volume to Darrell Kipp, and they did an introduction about what he did and how he did it, and to let people know about these things that are working and the things that aren't working. The government spent millions of dollars on No Child Left Behind, and that gap is still there. How can any taxpayer want to see their money wasted like that?
Are there any other questions?
Casey?
Yes,
I'd like to just make a comment. John, thank you so much for your very insightful and comprehensive presentation. And I know that there are several others that will watch it in the future. We chose this time because it was easiest for us just to keep the consistent time. But I had several people contact me saying that they we'll definitely listen to the presentation in the future. This week has just been crazy. We just had our powwow this past weekend, and we've got so much going on. But it's nice to see, Echo, that you joined us as well, and Lori and Lenore, I'm glad you're back again. And I'm not sure who else is on here, but I've read most of your research, but it was really wonderful to actually hear your personal experiences and to have you share some of the different things through the decades of work that you've put in as an educator and as a scholar. So thank you so much, John. I really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, if there's not any more questions, we'll end this webinar. We'll have another one next week, and I do believe it's Dr. Stiffarm that will be next week. So we look.
Can you send me an email about it? I think I've lost the email that gave me the original schedule of everything.
I sure can.
Link to get on it.
Yep, I sure can. So thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you.